we've got to a point, I think, where we have now quantified in some granularity and with some confidence gold's overall carbon footprint. And that includes scope 1, 2 and 3 upstream and downstream emissions according to GHG protocol definitions. So we've arrived at a very comprehensive picture of gold's carbon footprint. And that has allowed us to map out a high-level pathway to net zero in alignment with Paris climate targets. And that then has allowed us to further analyse what that pathway might mean in terms of if it's feasible, if it's cost effective, indeed if it's value creative, and also if that is practical on the ground. So it's not just at a high level, we've also examined what specific actions the gold sector might take that are likely to contribute to decarbonisation at a scale and time periods that will be particularly aligned with specific climate targets. And finally, we have conducted some research into how climate-related risks might impact gold performance as an asset. I won't focus on those today, but more than happy to talk to you at some other time if any of you are interested. Now, looking at some of those elements in more detail, our quantification of gold's carbon footprint, we calculated in total, that's around 126 million tonnes of CO2 or CO2 equivalent per annum. That said, for methodological reasons and the need to scale up and be as comprehensive as possible, the numbers may be actually an overstatement of the overall carbon footprint. But by being comprehensive, by taking the big picture view, that then enabled us to drill down into where gold's emissions are specifically generated, and that enabled us to then look at some of the implications of those sources and how they might be changed by future actions to decarbonise. Now, quite unusually, perhaps almost uniquely amongst mined products, gold has minimal emissions associated with its downstream uses. Basically, once produced, it is not used in ways associated with further emissions. The other key takeaway from this slide is gold's carbon footprint is caused almost entirely from the gold mining process. And within that process, the vast majority of emissions are associated with the use of electricity, either generated on site or purchased from the local grid. And as decarbonisation of electricity is increasingly accessible, and the cost curves for renewables and the reduced emissions intensity of grid power make it increasingly accessible and affordable, this concentrates the opportunity for gold to move towards carbon neutrality. It makes net zero gold a realistic prospect. And that ability to quantify the overall carbon footprint, but look at in more detail at specific emission sources, that's allowed us to then examine the pathway to net zero in some detail. And we did so by initially setting out the various options open to the industry, and a high-level overview of those is illustrated here. I'm aware there's quite a lot there, but overall it suggests that the pathway to net zero is accessible, cost-effective, and I would suggest actually over time value creating. And quite significantly, our more recent research has highlighted that the low-hanging fruit for near-term decarbonisation, as I say, is all about how the industry uses and sources its electricity. Now, we all know that over the next decade or so, it is key to move swiftly in terms of addressing the emissions associated with energy if the transition is not to be overly disruptive and less effective. So we need to move quite swiftly, and that means for gold, like for most sectors, we need to target substantial emissions reduction by 2030. We estimate this equates to a reduction of at least 27% over the next decade, if the industry is to be aligned with the below 2-degree Paris climate target, and at least 46% emissions reduction by 2030, if the 1.5-degree target is to be potentially in reach. Now, the chart on screen offers a high-level view of our recent findings, looking at potential progress over the next decade. It extrapolates from current industry actions and grid transition trends, and uses rational and realistic expectations to show the scale of actions and the impacts needed to reshape overall emissions reduction in order to be on track to meet Paris targets. Now, these are charted as cumulative actions and impacts over the next decade, but in practice, of course, they will likely emerge in parallel. And I should point out that our research goes into far greater detail, but this is very much a bird's eye view. And there will, of course, be hurdles to be overcome, but our analysis suggests that they should be far from insurmountable, and therefore the gold mining sector is in a relatively positive place to embrace the opportunity to transition. And by analysing specific actions, specific changes in energy use, and the wider power landscape, we can take a fairly detailed view as to what specifically might be needed if the industry is to move forward and, as I say, align itself with 2-degree and 1.5-degree climate targets. A lot needs to be done. It won't be simple or easy, but there are clear signs that the industry has now embarked on the journey. And we've already documented in some detail elsewhere that the industry is moving to embrace cleaner, safer, more energy efficient technologies which will support further emissions reduction actions. But this is also very much a global view. The most effective pathway to decarbonising gold mines' power emissions will undoubtedly vary very greatly from country to country and from region to region. If we look at this view, but from an African perspective, from what we currently know of African gold mines, then the position changes. And we can see that the local grid transition and the gradual closure of higher emission mines across the continent will likely have an even greater impact in terms of allowing alignment to climate targets. And if we look specifically at Africa's key gold mining nations, we see huge differences in the power sources that are driving the mines in different countries. And of course that results in great variation in average power consumption and the energy and emissions intensity of gold production in specific countries. So in some countries there will be the opportunity to decarbonise the grid, and that will have a positive impact on gold mining emissions. Elsewhere you will need to move away from fossil fuel based power generation at the site, and there will be huge variation in terms of the accessible pathway to net zero. But there is much to be gained from encouraging Africa's increased use of renewables, both obviously on site, but also in terms of the local grids. A recent academic paper looking at the various contributing nations to the West Africa Power Pool, for example, estimated that with better coordination and complementary use of different renewable energy sources suited to the different countries' climatic and natural resources, the whole region might reduce its energy costs and its emissions intensity while stabilising supply. And I think the estimated emissions intensity of power across the region is calculated to potentially fall by 30% if there was that coordination and complementary use of renewable sources.